a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and am joined by two guests, Dr. Larry Garrity, both of you from La Sierra University, but Dr. Larry Garrity, a former president and archaeologist, dating back to your first excavations when?
1968.
1968, and that was in Jordan, at Heshbon.
Actually, Gezer before that.
Yeah, you had done something in the early 60s, right? Or mid?
That was the same summer, 68.
Same summer, you did it.
Started in Gezer and then went to Heshbon.
We might even get to Gezer this evening.
Yeah.
It's in Joshua, so.
Right.
And then Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra University. All of us, a long history of involvement in excavations, in archaeology, all of us with a deep commitment to Scripture, and especially to the Old Testament. That's where our training has taken us. So it's been a privilege, and in a sense, we're all co-hosts. We're kind of asking each other questions here, and that may add to the dynamic of it. The book of Joshua, just a quick response. Is Joshua literature that you are drawn to? Is it literature that you will read later? Is it literature that encourages you? How does the book of Joshua strike you?
Well, it's one of the books that has a lot of stories that are familiar to kids starting with Bible stories when they're little. Certainly Joshua, but Jericho, Rahab, the Battle of Ai. Many of these stories really do resonate with
Achan.
I guess, Achan. You remember that one, right?
Right.
But sort of the victory after the challenge of the wilderness. But there's another side, that
sure.
I have to.
Can we call it the dark side?
Yeah, there is a dark side.
The destruction, especially at the divine command. In fact, the use of do I pronounce it the harem? Or is it haram or harem?
Harem in Hebrew.
Which is basically offering a place up as a whole burnt offering, and all the people. I mean, that's Joshua.
We have contemporary texts from surrounding countries or nations that do that too, so we know the context, but it's something we wouldn't do in this day and age.
We wouldn't think of that as appropriate.
In this day and age.
Unless you were ISIS, maybe.
I have thought about maybe I would put it the role of extreme religion. And I'm not going to use that language with Joshua, but in a sense the same sort of destroy the whole culture, destroy everything that's there. And we typically think about that in terms of cleansing it for the sake of a different kind of religion. That's pretty strong medicine.
It is.
That forces us to think about it. So, and it's one of your favorite. Would you open up Joshua to read devotionally? Is that?
I wouldn't for devotional reasons, no. I mean, it is a favorite as you're growing up because of the stories, as Kent says. But as an adult, it's more the challenges to, does God really inspire people to do those things? Or is that their understanding of what he expected them to do,
And does inspiration function in that way, that you take people, people are part of this process by which Scripture comes to us.
Right.
You take people where they are, and they have categories of thought, they have worldviews, they have culture that informs how they think about these things.
And we know that for that period because of all the literature from the ancient Near Eastern world that archaeologists have turned up through the years. And so fortunately, we can put Joshua in its ancient Near Eastern context and understand it better.
We actually need to finish up part of a conversation from our last episode. But before we turn to some slides to help us do that, we do have some artifacts. Take just a minute. Larry and Kent, talk about the artifacts in front of us.
Well, these are all, I think, on the table. They're all artifacts from the biblical period, and they mostly have to do with war. and violence and destruction. And so they are here to sort of remind us and illustrate what Joshua is all about.
Right.
Beautiful workmanship. If you think about a sword like this, very carefully crafted, and a bronze. But we have swords for close-range fighting, javelins, which could be thrown but also poke between the armor, spears, battle axes. Again, close-range combat weapons.
And I think
Arrowheads.
Arrowheads, right.
I think we can actually locate in skeletons, in burials, indications of the use of battle axes. Can't we do
Yes, we have puncture holes in skulls that exactly match the dimensions of battle axes.
So we're doing some CSI, some forensic science here?
We do.
We do. And then over here, we have some stone and some ceramic. Kent, the ceramic stuff is...
Well, these are typical vessels for the most part, contemporary with our stories in Joshua, some slightly earlier. But again, these would be vessels that, well, they would have been used by people who may have heard of these figures from the Bible that we're reading about. And of course,
then the stone mace heads for close battle and sling stones, perhaps.
We have pictures of Pharaoh. He'd like to be depicted holding the captive and getting ready to hit the head.
They were also used ceremonially, weren't they, too?
Correct. Now, I have a book that I'm interested in talking about for just a minute, because part of our conversation today will have to do with people groups. And this book on the peoples of the Old Testament world is really very helpful. If one wants to think about the background of Philistines or of the Horites or of the Hivites. Did I say Hivites or Hivites?
Oh, Hivites.
I think we would normally say Hivites, wouldn't we?
In Britain, they say Hivites, but I think we're Americans.
That's right. We're going to do it the American way here. So, and so this book is actually quite helpful in explaining who these people are. We don't have the time to do it here for all of them, but we will at least take a look at some of them. Last time, in our last episode, the first one on Joshua, this is the second one, we'll have one more, we started talking about sites, some of which present us with good news, matches the biblical record the way we kind of have always thought that it would, and then sites that don't. And there are in Joshua lots and lots and lots that don't seem to match well. So we talked about the good news and the potentially good news, that maybe we can discover something that would open some new windows for us, and in the process actually could strengthen our faith. I've thought that is really the case, that I don't think you can stare this long line of evidence in the face and say it doesn't exist.
No.
So how do we adjust? And how do we do it faithfully? Maybe that's the word I want. So we didn't finish. We started thinking about Jericho, and even before that, the basic outline of the book. You have Jericho and Ai in the first 8 chapters, and then the conquest of South and North Canaan, up through chapter 12. And then the rest of the book, half of it, is dealing with the parceling out of the land, and some addresses by Joshua. Back to Jericho. This is a different picture than we saw before, but it does give an indication. Kent, talk to us about the structures that we see here.
Right. Well, it's Jericho is built in the place that it is because of Elisha's spring, well, later called Elisha's spring. And so you can see, as Larry pointed out last week, that the city is sort of cradling the source of the water. It's an oasis. Jericho is down in the Rift Valley. And then you have the Middle Bronze Age rampart and wall, which encircled this. In the Middle Bronze Age, time of Abraham, they built these massive earth ramparts, like a donut almost, around a city. And the walls could be built on top. And we have then an early Neolithic tower here, the round tower that's famous. People are familiar with seeing that structure. Some Iron Age houses excavated down in this area. And so, of course, people then would look for the Jericho of Joshua's time, and what elements or what part could be identified
And
with that.
if I remember the conversation from last time, it was the Middle Bronze Age walls that were thought originally to be these massive walls. They are massive walls, and they were thought to be Joshua's
And you can
walls.
still see in one area the mud bricks stacked up that are part of that wall, and some of the damage to it. But the question is that the city of Joshua? And careful excavation after Garstang, the one who first identified
the 30s
it.
was
30s,
that he did his.
It was.
And then Kathleen Kenyon comes along.
She comes
with
along.
What, more sophisticated methods and a better understanding of pottery?
Yeah, real focus on stratigraphy, identifying the layers and how they relate, and leaving then vertical sections, the squares that we do excavations in, and leaving the box so you can see what you've gone down through to really carefully document.
Right.
And she realized that this really dates to the middle of the 16th century. And so then the question is, what follows that could be the city of Joshua? And that's where it became a little bit
That's right. And
difficult.
she found what?
She found very little. There was none of the imported pottery that was very popular at that time in well-off cities. Domestic pottery, local pottery, again, very minimal. There were some squatters or there were some residents, but it wasn't a great city, and there were no evidences of walls.
Right. Okay, so Jericho. Let's think about another site. The story moves from Jericho to Ai. I guess maybe I learned it as Ai, but I guess the Hebrew pronunciation.
Yeah, I think I made that shift somewhere too when I learned Hebrew.
Right. I think that's what did it for all of us. And so we do so. An older picture, but it shows the archaeological site of Ai, excavated by
The Southern Baptist Seminary.
A Southern Baptist seminarian who was certain that he was going to find some kind of evidence tying it to the conquest.
I remember his talk at one of his early things. I know where I is, he said.
Joseph Calloway.
Joseph Calloway, right.
Who, in some ways, ruled the day that as a biblical archaeologist, he went to excavate Ai. Because what did it tell him?
There's a massive city there. It's one of the biggest in the Central Highlands, but it dates to the early Bronze Age.
Right.
And it was abandoned, as were all cities in the at that time period, nearly all, and not reoccupied. Apparently, there were no indications of occupation until the early Israelite layers.
Right.
And so he asked, as I think most people do, who try to connect that with the story in Joshua, where were the people that Joshua fought against?
Right.
If the city was just a ruins.
Right.
You know, the name of the tell, or the city, Ai, maybe gives us a hint, because it means ruin. Right. And so if already in Bible times it was a ruin, maybe there was a regiment that fought them in the ruins, but it wasn't really a living city as we would expect it.
Well, others have suggested, I'm thinking especially of people like Anson Rainey, who passed away a couple years ago, who made the interesting suggestion that when Bible writers are writing these things down, they're using the geography that they know.
Yeah.
It was called Et Tel. I mean, that's one of. It means the ruin, like I does, and so it's possible that identifying a site is something that a later writer would do, that connects it with the story. But then when scientists come along, well, maybe the story happened somewhere else, or perhaps there's something that we're not catching about the story. Maybe there's something of a cultural memory that perhaps wasn't even intended as history. I think these dynamics at least provide us with a way to explore. I don't think we have easy answers.
You and I met at a site like that called Heshbon.
We did. Let's look at that one. This is another picture of Ai, but we turn to Heshbon. Larry, you excavated here. I excavated here. Kent, you weren't
I heard
quite,
about it.
You heard about it, that's right. So, Larry, what did Dr. Horn?
Yeah, Dr. Horn was very interested in the dating of the Exodus, and if you read, the texts in 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26, it would lead you to believe that the Exodus took place sometime around maybe 1450 and the conquest around 1400. And the very first site where the Israelites engaged in battle was at Heshbon, which was supervised or ruled over by Sihon, the king of the Amorites. And so Dr. Horn said, if we can dig there, maybe we'll find results of this battle. That will help to solidify the dating of the Exodus. And so we started in 1968, but by the very next season, it was quickly evident that there was no late bronze, which is the period that we usually tie to the Exodus and Conquest, was just not there. It starts around 1200 BC. That's called Iron 1. And so it was a good candidate from then on for everything we know about it from the Bible, but not a good candidate for Sihon's city. And so ever since we've struggled with that discovery.
This might be an illustration, a good illustration of what I was saying a minute ago, that here's a site everybody knew biblically, and by that I mean throughout the Old Testament, where Heshbon is.
Right.
Heshbon comes on the scene in the early Iron Age, 1100, something like that. People knew where it was.
And it's mentioned throughout the Old Testament.
It is.
Everybody knew that story.
That's right. And so and in fact, I think I remember Dr. Horn saying on occasion, maybe the real Heshbon is elsewhere.
Right.
And maybe this is a later Heshbon. It's hard to know. I'm not sure a lot of scholars follow that particular line. But it's certainly the case that this city was not around. Whenever you date the Exodus, it wasn't around. So we've got these sites, and there are others that we could talk about, that challenge us to think about what potentially could they tell us that would be helpful. What might give us a new angle, maybe a new perspective on this time period. Then we also have sites like the next three. Kent, this is what I pronounce it Chatzor.
Yeah, Chatzor, Hazor is the traditional way. This is the great city of the Canaanites at this time. The head of all those cities, kingdoms, as Joshua said. You can make out the Acropolis, or the Tell. This is the main site of Hatzor, except that in the Middle Bronze Age, when they built those ramparts, they enclosed a huge lower city. You can see it going clear out and around, and actually off the picture here in the back around. So that's the lower city. You can see some excavation areas there. So it was a huge city compared to all of the others. As it relates to Joshua, excavators have found two destruction layers, one at about 1400 BC and one at about 1200 BC. So Hatzor would fit either of the favorite periods of the conquest of Joshua. Fiery destruction, just like, I think Joshua says 3 cities were burned with fire out of the
and I think that the excavator, Amnon Ben-Tor, actually makes that suggestion.
Yes, he
we
does.
can't tie it to anybody else, so...
He eliminates the Egyptians weren't a possibility. There are really no foreign powers that could be credited for the 1200 BC.
Now, his associate, who unfortunately passed away recently, Sharon Zuckerman, she had suggested that this was an internal revolt. I'm not sure that she and the director ever came exactly to terms about that, but...
there's some tension there.
Yes.
Over that. But it's a great example of a fit. It fits.
Another example of a fit, Larry?
Bethel is in the hill country just north of Jerusalem, and it's a site mentioned in the stories in Joshua, and does seem to have occupation there during the time that we would expect to be the time of the Bible.
And we'll go, Kent, to one more. We've gone from the north of the country to the central part, now to the south, actually southwest. Lachish.
Lachish was a thriving late Bronze Age city. We have temples on top, we have temples on the side. And it was destroyed also at about that time. So it fits.
Now, they fit roughly, right? Because in terms of narrowing the destruction time specifically, there's probably some give and take there.
Sure.
But at least
But in
they
the sense
seem
that
to match.
there was occupation, there were people
Right,
living there.
right.
Nobody
and there's a
doubts that it's the
transition.
right site for Lachish or Lachish.
right.
Yeah.
I think that these three, Hatzor, Bethel, and Lachish, or Lachish, are the ones that are probably the best illustrations and the best fits. Maybe in some people's argument, maybe the only fits, because there are lots of other settlements, but there's still some that haven't been excavated, and there's still much more work to do. And so in some ways, we hold it as an open question. We continue to search and do research to try to see how we can find matches between archaeology and the Bible. We also recognize that there is some pretty strong evidence that suggests maybe we can think about this in new and creative and still faithful ways. And so we keep doing that. We keep working at it. Because of these contradictions, I mean, if you had only the type of illustration from Hatzor, Bethel, and Lachish, we wouldn't have the chart we have here. But since there are sites that don't match the biblical record so clearly or cleanly, talk to us about these. What is this lightning military strike, Larry? What book does that match?
Well, certainly the book of Joshua at a face value reading would seem like Joshua led his troops into the central part of the country, then they moved south in a sort of a swing to all the cities that are mentioned, and then they went up to Galilee, and Hatzor was the head of all those kingdoms and took care of them. And so with those three sort of pronged approach, it leaves you with the feeling that the country was pacified, and now we can divide it up among the 12 tribes.
And there actually are references in Joshua that says that there is now peace in the land. There are other references in Joshua and in Judges that suggest that there's still more work to do. But there probably was this sense that, wow, it's good to be done with that, at least with that part. So some kind of assessment that's positive. Kent, what is this second one on the list?
Well, as scholars went face to face with the archaeological evidence, they tried to after this period, we have the first archaeological evidence of Israel. We have all these villages around. So we know Israel gets there. But the question is, how does it get there? So these are models of how Israel gets there. And the nomadic infiltration model tried to come to terms with a lack of destruction levels in a lot of, well, Joshua 12 mentions 31 kings who were conquered. We've excavated 22 of those sites, 26 are probably identified. And so if we don't see destruction levels in all of those sites, or even if we don't see occupation in all of those sites, how then do we model the arrival of Israel? So the nomadic infiltration suggests that the Israelites were living as sheep and goat herders, as they had been in the wilderness, and that they moved in between and amidst the Canaanite cities and settled down and slowly then rose to dominance over their neighbors.
And not without conflicts, but still more periodic and more over time, occasional.
And I might say that actually fits with parts of Joshua, and especially Judges, because only 3 of the cities were said to be conquered. So when we look for confirmation or concordance with the archaeological record, what we have to keep in mind, what does it mean that Joshua conquered these kings? It could be a battle route, and then they went home to their cities.
So we have some fun. But the book of Judges closer to this one.
It is.
And even biblically, within the biblical text, you do have these different emphases. So the Bible writers didn't seem to mind putting a couple of perspectives next to each other. Maybe we're too uptight about it. Maybe we should allow a little bit more flexibility too, especially when Judges seems to match the biblical record or the archaeological record better. Peasants Revolt. Okay, so a sociologist basically invented this, Norman Gottwald. What did he say?
Well, he said that the Israelites moved in and settled these, started these little villages in the high country, and as they got stronger, they ran into their Canaanite neighbors, and the Canaanites were the settled people who were there with the power, And these peasants sort of revolted and sought their freedom. They wanted to exercise their rights in this country that they had begun to live in. And so it became a battle between the underprivileged, should we say, or the poor people, and those who were the historic sort
and
of,
the poor people would have then moved to the hill country. Is that, I mean, I'm remembering part of that.
Yeah.
So that then you have people actually through some sort of socialist revolt.
A revolt, yeah.
Right. Symbiosis tends to suggest a pulling together, a meshing of urban and rural lifestyles. And you can see evidence for both in these early settlements. And so in Jordan, it's hard to know. I mean, it's not quite as pressing in Jordan as it is in Israel. I mean, these are root stories. These are origin stories.
Right.
These are family stories. So it's important that we think about them in those terms.
And I think we need to remember the many references in the Exodus to the mixed multitude. It wasn't just Israel coming, it was all the other people that came out of Egypt with Israel. And yet they became Israel.
Right. So there may be ways of pulling all of these, or at least most of them together in some sort of comprehensive, at least cohesive sort of way.
There's no one theory that sort of answers all the evidence. It takes a combination of these to sort of explain what's happening.
And so this map, which I think is the last one we'll get to at this particular episode of our program, has all of these dots around there. Now, I put those on there, but I'm going to ask you why I put those on there.
Well, they represent all these villages that we find in early Iron period, around 1200 or so, a little earlier sometimes. And there's some evidence to suggest that maybe on the Transjordan side, on the eastern side of the river, that they're a little bit earlier than on the western side. And if that were the case, that fits the biblical narrative well. But anyway, where you see those red dots, where you put those red dots, we have all these villages that belong to this period, and it seems to be a cohesive culture at that time. And some large group has moved in and settled there, and the Bible tells us it was the Israelite tribes.
And we talk about hundreds of settlements, probably 300, probably on both sides of the river.
Right.
The highlands,
And these
the
are, that's right, and these are tribal groups. Probably not necessarily one being Israel and one not, but somehow being tribal groups that over time coalesce into what we call the nations of Israel and Judah. So hill country, if we want to know archaeology of earliest Israel, it's in the green. That's what
we can trace it backwards from later when we have text identifying them.
Right. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, Larry. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We hope this has provided something for you to think about and something to encourage your faith, even if in new ways. Until next time, keep believing and keep exploring.